On the evening of October 15th, 1888, the town of Fort Smith, Arkansas, bore witness to an event that would whisper through its history for generations. A wedding was held between 45-year-old Nathaniel Decker and 22-year-old Rose Sullivan, just 3 months after the untimely death of Nathaniel's only son, William. The young man's passing had been explained away as a hunting accident. Yet, for those who looked more closely, the story never seemed to fit. What outwardly appeared to be a grieving father offering protection to his late son's bride was in truth the final act of one of the most deliberate and unsettling conspiracies Sebastian County had ever known. The truth, slowly uncovered in courthouse records hidden beneath dust for more than a century, reveals a chilling pattern. 3 earlier failed attempts on William's life, a long campaign of subtle poisoning, and finally, the carefully staged accident that ended it all. Whenever a witness tried to speak, they vanished, fell silent, or were found dead themselves. The record is fractured, but the fragments form a haunting image of passion twisted into treachery of desire, hardened into murder. Before we step deeper into this tale of Nathaniel Decker and the woman who stood beside him in betrayal, pause with us. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from tonight. Because the story you're about to hear of, forbidden love of ambition and of a son, sacrificed, may leave you questioning how far people will go when passion crosses into obsession. Sebastian County in 1888 was a land of prosperity. Timber wealth and the river trade brought fortune and power to its lumber barons, ranchers and merchants. Fort Smith, once a rough frontier post, had become a thriving center of commerce, where new fortunes were made and reputations rose or crumbled overnight. It was here that Nathaniel Decker, an ambitious young man from Tennessee, had arrived 15 years earlier. With a keen eye for opportunity, he transformed a failing sawmill into the largest lumber operation between Little Rock and the Indian Territory. By the late 1880s, his company employed over 200 men, controlled thousands of acres of Ozark timberland, and shipped lumber as far away as Kansas City and New Orleans. Nathaniel himself stood as a commanding figure in Fort Smith society. Tall, broad-shouldered, with steel grey hair and sharp blue eyes, he carried himself with authority. His wife Margaret had died of consumption 3 years before leaving him with William, their only child, then a young man of fragile health and gentle spirit. William bore his father's intelligence, but not his ruthlessness. He kept to the books and correspondence of the lumber trade, far from the saws and the sweat Nathaniel believed made men. Where his father demanded ambition, William preferred compromise. Where Nathaniel saw conquest, William saw duty. The lumber camps sprawled eastward into the wooded hills linked to the mill by rail lines that carried massive logs down to the Arkansas River. Their hundreds of Irish and German laborers toiled in punishing conditions, 6 days a week, year after year, losing lives as often as they lost wages. On Saturdays, they filled Fort Smith's River District taverns with noise and drink. It was into this rough world, with its mix of fortune and danger, that Rose Sullivan stepped on a crisp September morning in 1888. She arrived from Boston with little more than a carpetbag and a letter of introduction. Born in County Cork, Ireland, she had crossed the Atlantic as a child. Poverty shadowed her family. Her father dead of tuberculosis, her mother struggling to raise 3 children amid prejudice and want. when a parish broker offered news that a wealthy Arkansas heir was seeking a devout Irish wife, the Sullivans saw hope at last. William's letters had painted a picture of gentle manners, poetry, and plans for the family's future. He sent money for Rose's journey, and she traveled by train to New York, then by steamer down the Mississippi, and finally upriver into Arkansas. But when Rose met William for the first time, kind, polite, apologetic to a fault, she felt a quiet disappointment settle inside her. He was everything his letters promised, but nothing more. He was safe, unremarkable, fragile. The Decker mansion on Garrison Avenue stood as a testament to the family's wealth. 3 stories of Victorian elegance with ornate porches, imported mahogany, and oil paintings glowing under crystal chandeliers. Servants carried Rose's belongings upstairs while the family prepared to welcome her with ceremony. It was at the dining table that first evening, however, that Rose's carefully imagined future began to bend in ways she could not yet grasp. Across the table sat Nathaniel Decker. Confident, magnetic, commanding in every gesture, he was the opposite of his son in every respect. And as the chandeliers cast their golden light across polished mahogany, something far darker than courtship began to take root, a spark of attraction that would soon ignite into betrayal, conspiracy, and blood. The Decker dining table could seat a dozen guests with ease, but on that September evening, only 3 places had been set beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. At precisely 7 o'clock, as was his habit, Nathaniel entered the room in a tailored black suit that emphasized both his broad shoulders and his commanding height. Rose, who had been politely discussing William's book collection, felt her breath falter as she watched the older man stride across the floor with the easy authority of someone long accustomed to obedience. "Father, may I present Miss Rose Sullivan." William rose awkwardly from his chair, his movements nervous and uncertain. "Rose, this is my father, Nathaniel Decker." Nathaniel took her hand in both of his, holding it longer than propriety, allowed his piercing blue eyes studying her face as though weighing every detail. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice deep, resonant, almost magnetic. "William's letters did not begin to capture your beauty. Welcome to our home." It was an inappropriate remark for a father to make about his son's betrothed. Yet, Rose found herself stirred by it. After years of being treated as little more than a servant or a charity case, Nathaniel's boldness felt less like impropriety and more like recognition, a signal that he saw her not merely as a wife in waiting, but as a woman of worth. Throughout dinner, her eyes strayed to him again and again. William, nervous and deferential, spoke gently of their planned honeymoon in New Orleans. But Nathaniel commanded the table with ease, spinning stories of lumber contracts, politics, and the rise of Fort Smith. When he spoke of employing hundreds of men and mastering thousands of acres of timberland, his words carried the weight of a man who bent the world to his will. Beside him, William seemed diminished, retreating into hesitant comments, quickly softened with phrases like, "I could be mistaken," or perhaps, "Father sees it better." As dessert was served, Nathaniel turned his attention back to Rose. "You must understand, Miss Sullivan," he said with an affectionate smile that did not soften the steel in his voice. "William has many virtues, but business requires a certain ruthlessness. It does not come naturally to him. He is too gentle for his own good." The words were wrapped in kindness, but Rose heard the judgment beneath them. Nathaniel saw weakness even in his only son and felt no hesitation in exposing it. When William offered to show Rose the family library after the meal, Nathaniel interrupted. Perhaps Miss Sullivan would prefer something more practical. Tomorrow I ride to Camp 3 to inspect our new steam donkey. If she is to marry into the lumber business, she should see where the fortune comes from. William hesitated, his face falling. He had imagined a quiet morning spent introducing Rose to his poetry. But his father's suggestion was less a proposal than a command. Of course, he murmured, if Rose would like that. Rose accepted, though she could not have explained why. Perhaps it was the danger in Nathaniel's invitation. And perhaps it was that danger itself, something absent from her carefully ordered life, that called to her. The next morning broke clear and cool autumn, beginning to touch the oak and maple trees that cloaked the hills. Rose dressed in a simple woolen gown that allowed her to ride and made her way to the stables. Nathaniel was already waiting, holding the reins of 2 horses, a calm mare for her and a powerful black stallion for himself. William was conspicuously absent. My son sends his regrets, Nathaniel explained as he lifted her into the saddle. An urgent matter in Van Buren demanded his attention. Business waits for no one. Rose accepted the explanation, though something in Nathaniel's tone suggested William's absence was more convenient than accidental. For nearly 2 hours, they rode through misted forest paths, the wheels of wagons having carved deep ruts into the logging roads. Nathaniel proved an engaging companion, pointing out ridges where he had felled his first timber, telling of the challenges and triumphs of building an empire from raw forest. His voice carried pride when he spoke of the satisfaction of felling oaks that had stood for centuries, or the challenge of dragging logs down treacherous slopes with nothing but ingenuity and will. At last, they reached Camp 3, a clearing perched above the Arkansas River Valley, where piles of freshly cut logs surrounded rough-hewn bunkhouses. At the center stood the new steam donkey, its boiler already fired gears groaning as it hauled a 1,000-pound log up a slope. Rose expected to watch from a distance, but Nathaniel insisted she learn. He explained each part of the machinery, how the steel cables could move loads too massive for horses, how the positioning of the lines kept men from being crushed beneath falling timber. Then, standing behind her, he guided her hands to the controls. The machine shuddered, the log inched forward, and Rose felt the weight of it yield to her command. "You have good instincts," Nathaniel said softly. "Most women would never dare try." "I'm not most women," Rose replied before she could stop herself. Nathaniel's smile was slow, deliberate, almost dangerous. "No," he murmured. "You certainly are not." They ate their midday meal at a rough-hewn table outside the camp foreman's office, chewing sandwiches and sipping strong coffee, while Nathaniel scanned production reports and spoke in clipped tones with his crew leaders. Rose noticed the way the men listened. Respectful, yes, but also wary like men who knew that their livelihoods depended on pleasing the one man who held their fates in his ledger. It was on the ride back to Fort Smith that the conversation shifted, carrying with it the weight of something that could never be undone. They paused to rest their horses beside a creek winding through a grove of hickories when Nathaniel asked almost casually, "Tell me, Miss Sullivan, what are your expectations for marriage?" Rose hesitated. The proper answers came easily. Obedient support children to carry on the family name. Nathaniel nodded, but pressed further. Those are worthy ideals. But I asked what you hope to gain from marriage. Security is one thing. But what of your own ambitions? The question startled her. In Boston, no one had ever asked her what she hoped to gain. Survival had always been enough. At last, she admitted, I suppose I hope to matter, to be part of something that makes a difference. Nathaniel dismounted, crouching at the creek's edge. He skipped a stone across the water, its ripples spreading wider and wider. And do you believe William can give you that? The impropriety of the question burned her cheeks. She gave the polite answer that William was good, gentle, respectful. But Nathaniel's eyes demanded truth. No, she whispered. He will never build anything of his own. Nathaniel stepped close enough that she caught the scent of pine and smoke clinging to his coat. Then you understand my dilemma. I have built something that will die with me, because my son lacks the will to continue it. She should have stepped away, mounted. Her horse ended the conversation, but instead she asked, and what will you do about that? His answer came not in words, but in the brief brush of his fingers against hers as he helped her into the saddle. The touch lingered just long enough to carry a promise, dangerous, intoxicating, undeniable. They rode back in silence, the air between them charged the world already altered. When they reached the Decker mansion, William waited anxiously on the porch, his relief obvious. How was your ride? He asked. Educational? Rose answered, glancing toward Nathaniel, who gave the faintest smile at her choice of words. That night, lying awake in the guest room, Rose understood she had come to a crossroads. One path led to William comfort, stability, and a life of small compromises. The other led toward Nathaniel danger, power, and a hunger she had never dared name. Sleep brought her only dreams of iron machines, fallen timber, and the feel of his strong hands guiding hers over the levers of a steam donkey, powerful enough to shape the earth itself. The weeks that followed seemed on the surface entirely proper. Rose accompanied Nathaniel on excursions that William himself encouraged, believing she was learning about the business she would soon help represent. Yet each trip, each conversation, each stolen moment was part of a carefully woven net that drew her closer to Nathaniel's orbit. He arrived at the mansion with documents requiring immediate review, with architectural plans for expansion, with messages too urgent to wait until evening. Always he found reason to bring Rose with him to inspect timber at the riverside yards, to examine equipment brought in from Chicago, to review possible mill sites along the Arkansas. She accepted each invitation eagerly. Her intelligence, her curiosity, her ability to grasp technical detail all seemed to please him. But beneath the surface, something darker was unfolding. He was teaching her to see the world as he did, strength as necessity, weakness as liability, power as something to seize rather than await. William believes fairness ensures success, Nathaniel remarked one crisp October morning as they rode through his holdings. But fairness is a luxury only the strong can afford. Rose found herself nodding at words she might once have recoiled from. His logic felt undeniable. Meanwhile, William's own behavior shifted in subtle, troubling ways. Perhaps he sensed the current running beneath his household. Perhaps not. He became more attentive, more yielding, always asking what would please her, always deferring to his father's judgment. He sought Nathaniel's approval even in matters that belonged to him alone. He asked permission to walk with his fiancée, sought advice about wedding details that should have been private, and ended nearly every statement with perhaps father would know better. What might once have seemed considerate now appeared weak, indecisive. Where Nathaniel commanded, William yielded. Where Nathaniel acted, William hesitated. Rose began to feel in her bones what Nathaniel had meant. William was too gentle for a world that demanded strength, and for the first time, she wondered if she had been chosen for William at all, or if she had been drawn here for something else entirely. The decisive shift came on October 8th, just 12 days before the wedding that everyone in Fort Smith believed was inevitable. William, with his gentle diligence, had planned a private picnic along the Arkansas River at Ozark Landing, a favorite stop for paddle wheelers gathering timber from the Decca sawmill. He had arranged every detail: a carefully prepared lunch from the cook, a bouquet of autumn flowers cut by the groundskeeper, even a poem he had composed to read aloud as the sun sank behind the water. It was to be a moment of tenderness, a declaration of love in his quiet way. But when afternoon arrived, Nathaniel intervened. He announced with grave authority that a critical machinery breakdown threatened to shut down mill production for days. Repairs had to be completed immediately, and as the man responsible for equipment maintenance, William's presence was indispensable. Perhaps you could postpone your picnic until tomorrow. Nathaniel suggested, his voice tinged with practiced sympathy. William faltered, stricken by the choice laid before him. He pleaded weakly that the mill supervisor could handle the matter, but Nathaniel countered with cool logic. The supervisor lay ill, and the Chicago supplier of replacement parts would be gone by the next day. Refuse and the family business would suffer. Rose, watching in silence, understood what was happening. This was no simple request. It was a test, a carefully staged trial, in which William could either cling to his private happiness or bow to duty. Predictably, he chose duty. "Business must come first," William said after a long pause. "Rose will understand." He turned to her with genuine regret, promising their picnic would come tomorrow. But Rose saw with perfect clarity, William would always yield, always retreat from conflict, always sacrifice what was dearest in order to maintain peace. Nathaniel then offered a new suggestion: Rose might accompany him to observe the nighttime mill operations while William worked. To William, it was a kindness, a thoughtful way to ensure she was not left disappointed. To Rose, it was something else entirely, another door opening, another opportunity too precise to be coincidence. That evening, with William absorbed at the mill, Rose found herself alone with Nathaniel in the mansion's hallway. "Shall we go?" he asked, referring to the mill. Her answer came softly but firmly. "I'd rather not." Nathaniel smiled a smile that was both promise and warning. In that instant, a line was crossed, one that could never be retraced. What followed was not machinery tours or business lessons, but an October night in the garden, the air heavy with moonlight and confession. By the fountain, Nathaniel spoke plainly. He had been married. He knew the difference between affection and passion, and William offered one, while he could offer the other. "William is your son," Rose whispered. "Yes," Nathaniel admitted. and that makes this both impossible and inevitable. Here was a man who had built an empire with relentless calculation, yet now confessed desires that shattered propriety. Rose, who once dreamed only of escaping Boston poverty, felt the weight of choice pressing upon her: safety with William or power with Nathaniel. She begged for time. Nathaniel accepted with the calm of one who believed time itself was his ally. The next morning, William returned exhausted from a night of repairs overflowing with apologies. He asked with hopeful innocence whether his father had given Rose a thorough tour of the mill. Rose replied carefully that Nathaniel had deemed such sights inappropriate after dark. William, relieved, accepted this explanation without suspicion. But in that brief exchange of glances between Rose and Nathaniel, the first conspiracy was sealed, a small lie that would grow into a shadow neither William nor Fort Smith could ignore. In the days that followed, Nathaniel wove pretexts with greater boldness. Rose was invited to assess potential properties, to join business dinners with visiting buyers, to attend meetings under the guise of offering a woman's cultivated presence. William encouraged it, convinced it meant acceptance, blind to the truth that others in town had begun to notice. Adelaide Forrester, from her vantage on Garrison Avenue, observed Nathaniel's carriage, arriving at peculiar hours, staying far longer than business required. Thomas Brennan at the River District Hotel received requests for private dining and discreet rooms, often for associates who bore a remarkable likeness to Rose. Even Father Michael O'Brien, who was to bless the marriage, grew unsettled. When Rose spoke of marriage, it was not William she described. Her voice burned with ambition, with a desire to shape something lasting, to wield influence. Marriage, the priest reminded her, was a sacrament, not an enterprise. Rose nodded politely, but her words rang hollow, rehearsed more performance than belief. Whispers and observations might have remained idle gossip had it not been for the intervention of Margaret Henley, Fort Smith's most relentless busybody, and the wife of the town's second largest lumber dealer. Margaret had built her reputation not on wealth, but on secrets. With an encyclopedic knowledge of other people's business and an instinct for scandal sharpened over years, she had already exposed 3 adulterous affairs and 2 embezzlement schemes. She could smell impropriety before most even suspected it existed. Her suspicions first stirred when she spotted Nathaniel and Rose entering Murphy's Tavern on a Tuesday afternoon, while William was verifiably occupied with business in Van Buren. Murphy's was no place for polite society. It catered to rivermen loggers and cattle drovers who valued strong whiskey over refinement. No respectable father would escort his son's bride-to-be into such a den without reason, unless of course he was determined to avoid the eyes of Fort Smith's proper establishments. Margaret's curiosity flared into action. She enlisted her Irish maid Colleen Alley to coax details about wedding plans and married life from Rose. She persuaded her husband to bring Nathaniel into their weekly poker circle, wagering that a few drinks might loosen his tongue. She even timed her afternoon walks to coincide with the comings and goings at the Decker mansion. What she uncovered confirmed her darkest instincts. Nathaniel and Rose had been meeting in secret for weeks. Their conversations strayed far beyond business. Their glances lingered with unspoken intensity, and both carried a weight of emotion that propriety could not explain. More troubling still, Margaret observed William himself. Once steady and competent, he appeared suddenly fragile. At gatherings, his color was poor. He complained of headaches and stomach cramps. His voice lacked its usual calm assurance. Her husband, Harold Henley, returned from poker one evening with troubling news. William's performance at the mill had become unreliable. Nathaniel excused it as overwork, but supervisors whispered, otherwise young William could barely finish a day without collapsing into rest. Margaret's instincts, honed by years of uncovering hidden sins, told her this frailty was not natural. It was connected somehow to the forbidden bond between Nathaniel and Rose. Her chance to act came on October 17th, only 3 days before the wedding. The morning broke grey and wet rain, turning the unpaved streets to rivers of mud. It was the kind of weather that cloaked confidences and encouraged secret deeds. William was meant to travel to Little Rock that morning to finalize a contract with a new timber buyer, but violent stomach pains left him doubled in bed. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the family physician, examined him and declared it a simple matter of nerves. Young men, he explained to Nathaniel, often suffered such complaints before marriage. A few days' rest would restore him. Nathaniel outwardly accepted the doctor's concern etched across his features. But Rose saw something in his eyes. The doctor missed a fleeting spark of satisfaction, as though William's illness served some hidden purpose. With his son bedridden and the Little Rock negotiations pressing, Nathaniel volunteered to handle the trip himself. Casually, almost as an afterthought, he suggested Rose accompany him. "She has such an interest in the business," he said smoothly. "The experience would be educational." Dr. Hayes approved at once, remarking that her presence might lend refinement to rough timber dealings. Rose agreed with a swiftness that should have raised questions, but no one suspected. To all appearances, it was eagerness to support the family trade. In truth, it was the freedom she and Nathaniel had been waiting for. But Margaret Henley, watching from her window as the carriage rolled toward the station, understood perfectly. A father and his son's betrothed traveling alone to another city on the eve of a wedding already clouded with rumor. This was scandal, ripening into revelation. She acted quickly. A servant carried urgent telegrams to 3 of her most trusted contacts in Little Rock society, women with networks as sharp as her own, ordering them to observe and report every unusual detail. Then Margaret armed herself with a basket of herbs and the guise of maternal concern and paid a visit to the bedridden groom. William welcomed her gratefully. He looked wretched pale, trembling beneath heavy blankets, eyes dull where once they had shone with gentle intelligence. Settling beside him, Margaret cooed softly and asked about his health. He admitted that food had tasted strange for weeks, that nausea plagued him even with his favorite meals. He blamed nerves, yet Margaret had seen these symptoms before. 3 years earlier, she had watched Samuel Reeves waste away under what neighbors called a fever, though she alone suspected his wife's use of arsenic. And now, William showed the same signs: steady weight loss, stomach, agony, trembling hands, poison. "Tell me about your meals." Margaret urged, her tone careful. William answered slowly, his thoughts dulled by fatigue. His father often dined at hotels, he explained, while Rose frequently joined clients. He alone seemed to eat consistently at the mansion. Sometimes Nathaniel brought tonics from Dr. Hayes. Sometimes Rose offered tea or broth. He smiled faintly as he spoke of her thoughtfulness. Margaret felt a chill, deeper than the October rain. Here was method, opportunity, and motive, William trusting unguarded and perhaps already doomed. Yet Margaret, seasoned in the art of scandal, betrayed nothing. She pressed gently for details: the timing of meals, the worsening of symptoms, the rhythm of the household. By the time she left, she had gathered enough to piece together a sinister pattern. William's decline had begun after Rose's arrival worsened when Nathaniel was home and eased slightly whenever he traveled. Each fact alone might be dismissed. Together they formed a shadow darker than gossip. Margaret now carried within her the power to unmake lives with a single whispered accusation. But she also knew, when murder is suspected, proof must be ironclad, especially when the accused are the wealthiest man in Fort Smith and the Irish girl he had entangled in his household. Meanwhile, in Little Rock, distance only deepened the forbidden flame. Nathaniel and Rose discovered that leaving Fort Smith behind did not free them from temptation. It only magnified it. The train journey had offered them something that Fort Smith never could: hours of uninterrupted conversation. The clatter of the rails muffled the world outside, and in that enclosed space, Nathaniel and Rose found themselves speaking with a freedom they had never dared before. By the time they reached Little Rock, hotel accommodations had swept aside the need for careful chaperones, and the timber meetings had given them a stage where their intellectual compatibility was undeniable. "We work well together," Nathaniel remarked one evening as they reviewed contract terms in his hotel suite, the glow of lamplight softening the shadows. "You grasp the financial weight of these agreements better than William ever has." Rose, warmed by wine and by the rare experience of being valued for her mind instead of her usefulness as a wife, allowed herself an honesty she would not have risked at home. "William doesn't wish to understand," she confessed. "He performs his duties, yes, but there is no passion in them. He would rather spend his days with poetry than with ledgers or lumber." "And you?" Nathaniel asked, his voice low, his gaze steady. The question was not merely casual, it was a test. Rose returned his gaze without flinching. She knew her answer would decide whether they would continue their delicate pretense or step across the threshold of something irreversible. "I would rather build an empire." Nathaniel's response was wordless. When he kissed her, all the careful boundaries they had constructed collapsed in silence. Rose, answering him without hesitation, understood that this was a line neither could retreat from. That night was not only a union of passion, but also of whispered planning. Their future, they agreed without saying so directly, required removing the obstacles that bound them. "William's condition worsens," Nathaniel murmured in the dark hours before dawn. "Dr. Hayes suspects more than nervous exhaustion. Perhaps something fatal." Rose needed no further explanation. "Such things happen," she whispered. "Some men are too frail to endure what others survive." "Exactly. And when a son is lost too soon, is it not natural for a grieving father to comfort the bride he left behind?" But as they returned to Fort Smith, flush with their dangerous resolve, an unexpected presence chilled their triumph. Margaret Henley was waiting at the station. She greeted them politely, her voice carrying nothing more than pleasantries, but her eyes, sharp searching, spoke of knowledge that could not be ignored. "Poor William has been quite worried," she told Nathaniel with an almost careless smile. Curiously, he seemed improved this very afternoon. Her implication was unmistakable. She had noticed the link between William's failing health and his father's presence. She knew, or at least suspected, far more than was safe. As their carriage rolled homeward through the darkened streets, Nathaniel and Rose sat in silence, each feeling the same truth settle like a weight upon them. Margaret's watchful eye meant time was running out. If William's decline continued, it would no longer pass without question. They would need to act with swiftness and with precision. 2 mornings later, October 19th, 1888, the solution revealed itself under the guise of tradition. Nathaniel announced a farewell hunting trip for William, a bachelor's outing before the wedding. The young man, heartened by the crisp air and eager for companionship after weeks of illness, accepted joyfully. 6 men would go: William Nathaniel, Harold Henley, Dr. Samuel Hayes, Thomas Brennan, and James Crawford, the mill's chief supervisor. All respected, all capable hunters, all unquestionable witnesses to whatever might unfold. The chosen ground was a wild tract of timberland east of town. Dense underbrush, fallen trees, and echoing hills would scatter the hunters into solitude where the crack of a single rifle could be swallowed by confusion. Nathaniel, ever the careful strategist, directed the formation himself, ensuring that more than once he and his son would find themselves alone together in the shifting woods. What the others took as thoughtful leadership was, in truth, preparation for an accident, one that no one would ever prove. The morning hunt unfolded with deceptive calm. From time to time, a distant rifle crack echoed through the hills, proof that the men were pursuing game, yet no triumphant calls announced a clean kill. By midday, the group gathered again at a clearing beside a narrow creek. They unwrapped sandwiches, poured coffee from tin flasks, and shared easy laughter as they compared tracks and signs. William seemed reborn in the woods. His color returned, his voice lively. He accepted the teasing about his coming marriage with good humor. Even Dr. Hayes, who had been quietly worried, observed with approval. Fresh air and exercise work wonders, he declared. Nathaniel nodded along, though Rose, had she been present, would have recognized the faint irony in his expression. William looked like a man restored, which made what followed seem all the more cruel. After lunch, they fanned out once more. This time, Crawford led them toward a tract where deer signs seemed fresh. The ground grew steeper, the cover thicker, the kind of terrain where men could vanish from sight in only a few paces. Nathaniel positioned himself 50 yards behind his son, close enough for a clean shot, far enough to claim a mistake. The others scattered across the hills were absorbed in their own pursuits. At 2:30, a single rifle report tore the quiet. When the men converged, they found Nathaniel on his knees, hands red, pressing against his son's chest in a hopeless attempt to stop the bleeding. William lay still, the wound catastrophic. "I thought I saw a deer." Nathaniel gasped, his face twisted with anguish. It moved through the brush, and before I knew, "Oh God, what have I done?" The scene matched his words. William had been struck from behind, the kind of shot that could be explained as a hunting mishap in treacherous ground. Dr. Hayes confirmed what was obvious: death had been instantaneous. The other hunters, shocked but pragmatic, accepted it. They had seen accidents before. Crawford, the most seasoned among them, examined the position carefully and declared it a textbook tragedy. Only Harold Henley noticed what did not fit. Powder burns on William's clothing told of a shot fired much closer than the distance Nathaniel claimed. He kept his silence, unwilling to add cruelty to grief, but the doubt settled heavily in his mind. Back in Fort Smith, Rose played her role with practiced precision. She spent the afternoon in Margaret Henley's parlor, discussing flowers and menus, constructing her alibi. When the news arrived, she gasped, sobbed, and clutched at sympathy. The poor man, she murmured through her tears, to lose his son this way. And the day before the wedding, how will he survive it? To others, her grief appeared genuine. But Margaret, sharp-eyed as ever, caught something beneath the surface. Rose's words were sorrowful, but her eyes, they glimmered with something else. Not despair, but the flicker of satisfaction. By evening, as the hunting party trudged home with William's body, Margaret knew she had witnessed the conclusion of Sebastian County's most carefully staged murder. And she also knew there would be no proof. The evidence lay buried with the young man in Fort Smith Cemetery. William's funeral on October 21st drew the largest crowd the town had ever seen. Hundreds packed the Methodist church, spilling into the muddy streets. Nathaniel stood hollow-eyed, his grief and guilt on display. He collapsed at the graveside, overcome, convincing even skeptics that whatever had happened was accident, not intent. Rose, cloaked in mourning, black, received condolences with perfect dignity. Many urged her to return to Boston, but she declined. "I cannot abandon him," she told Father O'Brien softly. "William would want me to care for his father." The priest, uneasy but uncertain, agreed. Margaret Henley, however, understood too well. Rose had no intention of leaving Fort Smith. Here lay her prize-wealth, social standing, and a partner willing to bend the world to his will. But Margaret also knew accusation without evidence was useless. Nathaniel was untouchable without proof, and proof had been buried along with William. So she waited. She watched. She recorded. By Christmas, Nathaniel and Rose were often seen together, their grief giving cover for intimacy. By Easter, whispers of engagement passed through parlors and pews. And by June of 1889, 8 months after the fatal hunt, Nathaniel Decker and Rose Sullivan stood as husband and wife, their union blessed by society, even as its foundation rested on blood and silence. The marriage seemed on the surface to breathe new life into Nathaniel, and to grant Rose the position she had long coveted. Together they managed the expanding lumber empire with striking efficiency. They traveled to other cities under the banner of business, presented themselves as a couple, bound by shared loss, and spoke of building something enduring out of tragedy. To most it appeared noble, almost redemptive, but Margaret Henley's watchful eyes caught what others missed. Their intimacy was too familiar, too assured. These were not the tentative gestures of two people united by circumstance. Their laughter carried the echoes of long-practiced jokes. Their glances suggested years of complicity. More unsettling still, Rose displayed a mastery of the lumber trade that should have been impossible for someone supposedly tutored only after William's death. She argued contracts, analyzed markets, and balanced accounts with the skill of a seasoned partner. Harold Henley confirmed Margaret's suspicions. Rose had asked questions at board meetings that betrayed months, perhaps years of prior instruction. It was as though she had been preparing for William's absence all along. Margaret understood then the hunting accident had not been chance, but strategy. William's death was the removal of an obstacle, clearing the way for Rose and Nathaniel to rule side by side. Yet suspicion, no matter how damning, was not proof. Without witnesses, without confession, she could do nothing but wait for the cracks to show. The cracks came sooner than she expected. In the summer of 1891, James Crawford, the seasoned mill supervisor who had first declared William's death an accident, was found lifeless in his home. Dr. Hayes called it heart failure, citing weeks of chest pains. But Crawford's widow confided in Margaret her husband had been disturbed, frightened after visits from Nathaniel. He had spoken of inconsistencies, of matters that did not add up, of leaving Fort Smith before suspicions destroyed them. His knowledge made him dangerous, and Margaret saw at once why his silence had become necessary. 6 months later, Dr. Hayes himself was thrown from his horse, his neck broken. The gentle animal was said to have been startled by a snake, but the timing chilled Margaret. Hayes had been the physician who examined William, the one whose word had sealed the story of an accident. Now he too was gone. It was no longer a single crime. It was a pattern removal by design disguised as fate. And Margaret's fear deepened when her own husband began voicing doubts too openly. In March of 1892, Harold fell ill after a dinner at the Decker home. What began as stomach discomfort spiraled swiftly into collapse. Doctors called it spoiled oysters. Margaret, remembering William's lingering decline, knew it for what it was, deliberate poisoning. This time, however, she was prepared. Years of careful notes, coded letters, and whispered confidences with allies beyond Sebastian County gave her hope that truth might yet be heard. When Harold died on March 15th, Margaret carried her evidence to the telegraph office, ready to summon federal marshals. Yet the wires went unanswered. The nation's lawmen had greater concerns than whispers from Arkansas. In Fort Smith, the tale of Nathaniel and Rose had already hardened into legend, two souls who found love amid ashes, who turned sorrow into strength. The town clung to that narrative, unwilling to question it, unwilling to see blood beneath the romance. Nathaniel and Rose flourished. Their wealth spread across 3 states, their mansion dominated the skyline, their family became a pillar of respectability. Margaret, alone and silenced, died in 1894, buried scarcely 50 yards from William's grave. Her journals, hidden behind a false wall discovered decades later, revealed what the town had chosen not to see. And yet, even with her testimony, the myth endured. For nearly a century, history remembered the Deckers as visionaries, not conspirators. It was only in 1987, when construction workers unearthed Margaret's hidden records and letters between Nathaniel and Rose, that the truth of the conspiracy came fully into view. 5 lives taken, a community deceived, and history itself rewritten by the ruthless will of 2 people who refused restraint. That, perhaps, is the most unsettling lesson of all. That memory can be shaped, even corrupted, until murder becomes romance and silence becomes pride. The question remains, if Margaret had not left her journals, would anyone ever have known? Or are there still darker truths buried deeper, waiting for some future hand to uncover? What do you think, dear listener? Was Margaret's persistence enough to pierce the veil, or do shadows still cling to those Arkansas hills? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you wish to wander with us through more forgotten mysteries, subscribe, ring the bell, and join us again for the next tale where history's silence will whisper once more.